So here we are looking at the supply curve again, and we're going to stick with coffee. And again, this could be any product. It doesn't really matter if it's coffee or cars or speedboats or anything. We want to figure out what it is that determines what firms are willing and able to sell their product for. Remember, this curve only tells us what price they'd have to get for a certain quantity. In other words, to sell this much, they'd have to get at least that price. Right? So to sell this much, they'd have to get at least this price, or it's not worth it to them to do it. To sell this much, they'd have to get at least this price, or it's not worth it to them to do it. Or we could flip that on its head and say, well, at this price, well, the profit is a certain amount, I'll sell that much. At this price, the profit is a certain amount, I'll sell that much. But it doesn't tell us what goes into figuring out what the tolerable prices are for these quantities. In other words, this tells us what they're willing and able to do, but doesn't tell us what makes them willing and able to do it at those prices and quantities. We have to look at what we call non-price determinants of supply in order to figure that out. Well, if the cost of producing a product is fairly low, then profit is easy to make. In other words, if it doesn't cost me too much money to make a cup of coffee, I don't really need to necessarily charge that much for it to get that much out of it. If the cost of making the next cup of coffee isn't that big a deal, and it really isn't when you think of it, what is the cost of making an additional cup of coffee? A couple of more beans, another cup of water. You got to have your barista do that one more time. It's not really that expensive. We are seeing really good profit potential all along the way. In other words, if our costs are pretty low and our marginal cost, the cost of producing the next unit, is pretty low, then we're likely to want to supply quite a bit. We're likely to want to supply quite a bit, and maybe even supply quite a bit at a very shallow curve. In other words, if the costs are like this, or if the supply curve is like this, what this says is that, the next unit doesn't cost me very much to make, and therefore the profit potential is pretty good. Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do it at even lower prices. If the next unit is very costly to make, like a 747 or something like that, then the curve is likely to be much steeper because in that case, well, the next unit is quite expensive to make. I better get a really darn good price or it's not worth it to me to do that. Right? So really what we're looking at is how much does it cost a firm to make an additional unit of a cup of coffee or of 747 or whatever it might be. Right? So the things that really factor in and affect the costs of production, one is technology, right? The better the technology, the more output per hour or more output per day or just more output, the cost per unit of output is going to go down. Technology lowers the cost of producing things. It's going to tend to move the curve out here and maybe even flatten it. Again, flattening it depending on the product, but it's going to certainly give us a willingness to produce and sell a greater quantity at particular prices. Resource costs, like the resources for this cup of coffee, are the beans, the water, the building that I'm renting to put the coffee shop in, all of that. If these go down or up, it's going to change my willingness to produce. If it costs me more per cup because, say, the rent went up on the store, well, then I might need to get a higher price to stay in the game. In other words, more per cup, I'm going to need a higher price per cup because the profit needs to be there for me to stay in it. If it costs less, my rent went down, or I was able to hire people for cheaper, then, well, you know what? Maybe I'll supply more product at each and every price because the profit is easier to get. Expectations. I really expect that people are going to think that coffee is the next great thing. I know that this report about how coffee is it cures cancer or something like that, I don't know, is out, and people are going to really, the demand is going to really explode, and I'm just going to be ready for it by producing a lot of coffee. So at each and every price, I'm going to produce a lot more coffee. Taxes. If the government taxes me, that's an additional cost. It's harder to make profit. That means I need to get a better price. Subsidies means it's it's less expensive to make a product. That means I'm going to need to, I don't need to get as high a price in order to make a profit. Taxes will move the supply curve this way. Subsidies will move the supply curve that way. The number of firms, the more firms there are, just the farther out to the right there is. If there's 15 coffee shops in town, there's going to be more supply at each and every price. And then finally, shocks are something called, like in the case of coffee, it's unexpected events that you have no control over. So let's say some kind of insect eats the entire coffee bean harvest in South America. Well, clearly that's going to drive the price of coffee beans through the roof. That's going to make my supply curve jump way to the left because the beans are so expensive now. I really need to get a high price in order to make it worth my while to continue to produce. So these are all called non-price determinants. I'm going to erase these here, these curves, just to show what a shift looks like. Just to show what a shift looks like. So if we have an example of, say, resource costs go up, the price of coffee beans goes up, we're going to see that the curve for coffee is going to go here. Because if coffee beans get more expensive, I'm going to need, my incentives are to charge, to only sell if I can charge a higher price. I'll only sell that much if I can charge that price. I'll only sell that much if I can charge that price. Okay, so it's not that I can automatically do that. I can't just I can't automatically charge a higher price. It's that I would like to charge a higher price. I can't just simply charge that because the consumers have something to say about it. We can't force anybody to buy anything. But that's an example of where cost went up, so the curve shifted to the left. Let's say the cost of coffee beans went down. There was an enormous harvest of coffee beans, and it drove the price of coffee beans down. It's a lot cheaper for me to buy. Then I'm going to find that, well, you know what? I don't need to make as much, I don't need to have as high of a price because profit is easier to get. So I'm willing to charge, I'm willing to take a much lower price in each of these quantities in order to get profit. So basically this boils down to, these are all the non-price determinants. Basically this boils down to costs. Basically that all boils down to costs. If my costs increase, I'm going to find that my supply curve is going to shift to the left. If my costs decrease, my supply curve is going to shift to the right. How steep the supply curve is going to depend really on how hard it is to make an additional unit of output, and that's what we'll look at in the next video.